Mixed feelings and doubts were part of the sentiments leading up to COP27 in Egypt. Now, the United Nations Conference of Parties was happening a year filled with new weather extremes, food shortages, fossil fuel price spikes, and a rising cost of living, with Russia's fossil fuel financed war on Ukraine further stoking the crisis. This year, Africa has seen floods and storms kill hundreds of people across the south, triggering electricity shortages and disrupting freight operations and devastating homes and livelihoods, while drought has caused famine for millions of people in the Horn of Africa. The summit was also happening against the backdrop of the failure of Western countries to fulfill their pledges on climate finance, conversations around what a just energy transition would look like for African countries, and the demand for loss and damage. While it seemed COP27 would end without concrete action, a last-minute Hail Mary seems to have salvaged things. A historic agreement was reached to establish a fund to help poor countries cope with climate disasters. This has been in the works for more than 30 years, but at the dying minute, the U.S., which had stood against the plan, agreed. Rukaiya Rufai, partner for sustainability and climate change and public sector at PwC Nigeria, joins me now. Rukaiya, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me as well. So let's go back. We were together just about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks ago, when we had COP27 kicking off, and we're looking to see what could the possibility be of what would happen. Did you think, let me start with that, did you think that we'd be able to see this loss and damage fund actually being pulled through?
I honestly did, because if you look at the evolution of even coming up with the plans, it's like a step-by-step progressive elaborative process. And if you remember, when I came online last time to talk, we spoke about, this time around is to push for implementation, and definitely finance will come on board, and that moral high ground of the West, would be put on the table, and the call for climate justice to establish liability, and also, the damage, and compensation for the climate hit countries would definitely come on board. But to be honest, I wasn't very sure if a deal and the quantum of funding we've seen come out of COPE is actually surprising. It's a pleasant surprise.
COP. So this has taken 30 years, and the U.S. was one of the major, probably if not last, wealthy nation standouts. Why particularly were wealthy nations seemingly so against setting up this loss and damage fund? I, of course, have to mention the China part of this as well. China has been in favor, but has not wanted to be one of those who's donated towards the fund, because up to recently, they weren't necessarily considered a high income or wealthy nation as well. So why is it taking wealthy countries so long to agree to this?
I think, generally, even climate change, started with the need for the awareness, putting the structures to galvanize and enable the collaboration, so it's taken a lot to even get the pledges and get the commitment and even agree to have it, on the agenda. I think it's just normal skepticisms, and then competing priorities, and the political will as well. So if you look at the US, for example, there was a radical shift from the electoral outcomes. When Biden came into power, we saw a different stance, of US. So there's a lot of interworkings, and everyone, when you look at the whole diplomacy around it, and everyone is trying to look at their national interest. And to talk about China in particular, China's stance is, yes, they're emitting, but are they really the people that emitted? Their industrialization is not far-reaching like some of the more advanced nations. So, that's why China would take that stance to not be categorized with US, because the climate catastrophe, and the changes from, the emissions and the liability we're seeing are from anthropogenic, which is human-generated climate change
Okay.
that precedes China's development. So that's why you'll see that stance from them.
So let's get to the dollars and cents of the loss and damage fund. So what do we know about it in terms of how it's going to be established? Because a 30-year-old idea, which is now coming to be in 2022, may not still have the same sort of structure and outlook it had when the idea was first conceived. How will it be funded? What will the loss and damage fund do? Take us through that, especially in terms of the money that needs to go into it.
Okay. So definitely it's a breakthrough that parties have agreed to even establish the fund. The modalities and operationalization of the funds are part of the things that the agenda items for the next scope, which I think is scheduled to take place in UAE. In terms of funding the loss and damages, the first source is to tax the biggest oil and gas sectors. There's that proposal on the table to put a 10% tax on the profits of them, of the majors, the oil and gas majors, and is estimated that, $37 billion in 9 months will be raised in 2022 if this tax should take in. The second source is debt for climate, right? And France, Colombia, Barbados are part of the countries pushing for it as part of innovative financing. Then, of course, there are grants. There are grants, from the developed countries and the industrialized countries. But what we're seeing is bilateral agreements. They're taking shape in bilateral agreements. So, for example, Belgium pledged 25 million euros in an agreement with Mozambique. And out of that, 2.5 million would be for loss and damages. We're seeing the US also make pledges, for adaptation fund, and they're setting aside 150 million for Africa. There are more and more countries making the pledges, but for loss and damages, the only drawback that I'm seeing and the criticisms is the donations vis-a-vis, the climate liability. So Carbon Brief calculates US, for example, their loss and damages to be at a tune of about $40 billion, but US has committed $7.6 billion so far. So that climate justice, that word, is what everyone is expecting, the loss and damage contributions to mirror, such that is a function of your emissions, and the greenhouse gas emissions that have contributed to the climate catastrophe. So these are the three major sources. So to recap, tax on oil and gas profits, debt for climate, and then grants from developed countries.
Let's also look at this phrase that we've been hearing so much of, which is a just energy transition. So across Africa, an estimated 600 million people still lack access to electricity. And that's in large part because most of our fossil fuel investment is typically directed towards infrastructure for export rather than downstream delivery to Africans for use. But there's also no guarantee that the transition to solar, wind, hydro, and even geothermal will be just. We've seen some of the situations happening in Kenya in relation to, of course, the land grabbing allegations, which has to do with renewable energy. And what we also know is that at this point in time, the EU is even proposing that there's protection or that there's continued use of gas for them. African countries have said they will not leave resources in the ground which we could use for development, and many have also said they simply cannot afford to transition right now. So in terms of COP27, where do we stand right now when it comes to what a just energy transition would look like for the African continent?
So you make a very important point, and it's an imperative with that transition to ensure that it's also leveraged to create socio-economic outcomes. When you look at the challenges that Africa faces, including the science and the data, the scientific data around even the sources of emissions and those sources that needs to be decarbonized or added to the energy mix, access to capital, and the cost of capital. Those are the critical elements, and then preparing projects as well, such that, Africa can access cheap funding and grants. So for Africa and from COP, there is collaboration, around, galvanizing money. And Africa development is at the center of this. And we've seen US government, UK's government, contribute 200 million pounds. That's about $228 million to Africa development's climate action window. And a lot of it will be for green projects. We're seeing the sustainable energy for all, and there are projects popping up. But the fact is that, and you mentioned gas has been acknowledged as a transition fuel. And I think I remember watching one of his interviews where he was talking about some of the conflicts coming out from even climate leaders such as EU, because at a point, they categorized gas as brown, but now they're categorizing gas as green. But the consensus is gas is a transition fuel, and I just think still Africa just needs to look at the whole landscape, the evolving landscape, come up with their narratives and stance, prepare projects, and also try to leverage some of the sources of funding, because Africa is disadvantaged at accessing cheap loans that they can use to fund even their energy transition. But at the end of the day, I think it's all about an optimal energy mix that guarantees affordable, accessible, and energy security as well. So that's it at the end of the day, targeting these three.
So, Rukaiya, I have to ask you about this because we mention it every time we talk about this issue around climate financing, and that's in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen. The wealthy countries pledge $100 billion a year to developing countries by 2020. And that target has never been met in the 13 years since it was agreed. So beyond the loss and damage fund, where do we stand on climate financing coming out of COP27? Or has that $100 billion promised yearly gone into also the loss and damage fund? Has it sort of been subsumed there, or it continues to be a pledge that these countries need to meet?
So like I said earlier, loss and damage is about establishing liability and compensation for the hardest hit countries that are developing. Whereas climate finance takes into consideration what is needed with the transition. And the money is huge. So looking at loss and damage, the economic loss from natural disaster has been estimated to be at 227 billion. But when you look at the quantum of funding needed by developing countries with the transition, it's put at 2 trillion a year. So there are many other moving parts with climate finance and innovative financing to be able to raise and mobilize enough funding and resources, to help with adaptation and mitigation and the whole energy transition agenda. So there is a lot that has come out separately. Like I mentioned earlier, US, for example, has pledged $100 billion for adaptation, and 100 million, I think it's 100 million, dollars for adaptation fund, and they have a separate 150 million adaptation fund for Africa. There is discussion to even US and Germany promised to mobilize funding for Egypt. So they're looking at $100 million in form of debt relief, $100 million in form of loan, and $85 million in form of grants for their own energy transition. So climate finance, it's a whole different ballgame, and the funding is, the scale needed is way higher than loss and damages.
All right, the scale needed is way higher than loss and damage. Still a historic agreement, but the question many will be asking is where do we go from here? And will loss and damage really be established and actually end up doing what needs to be done? Rukaiya Rufai will end the conversation here for now. Let's look forward to the future, one that seems just a bit brighter with that last minute save coming from COP27. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and we've seen Africa this year alone go through a number of devastating climate impacts and climate disasters throughout the continent. We've seen droughts and floods, extreme weather, and hundreds of thousands displaced, as well as hundreds of people also losing their lives. We've been demanding for many years that the wealthier countries pay up for the emissions that have led the world to this point. But also, we're saying we have resources we won't leave in the ground for a transition that might still leave the African continent behind.